So I was just going to kick things off by asking, essentially the question, because you've just gotten back from Oxford. What were you doing out there?
I was doing the weirdest thing that academics do is I brought in 15 people, some of them from the UK, some of them from Europe, some from the Middle East, some from the United States. So brought people in from all over the world to sit in a room in Oxford at Wycliffe Hall and basically just talk about creation theology and different sciences and how evolutionary science, genetics, population genetics, biology, astrophysics, like how do these bear on how we understand the creation theology? But it was also not just a mix of scientists and theologians, but also a mix of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars. So it was super weird and like in the most, dorky, nerdy, exciting way to be sitting in a room with all these people who are really expert in what they do. And then no matter how expert they were, there were other people in the room that knew things they didn't, right? And so we were all just sitting there listening and learning from one another.
And so was there like a stated objective? Was it kind of just like, let's put these people in the room and see what happens, or?
Both of those, yeah,
Both of them.
stated
Okay, yeah.
objectives, but it was a pilot year for this project that I'm directing. We're calling it the Abrahamic Theistic Origins Project. So Abrahamic in the sense that you have Muslim, Jewish, and Christian. Abrahamic is a problematic term because it doesn't actually capture exactly, but we just mean, we didn't want to say Muslim, Christian, and Jewish every single time we said it. So Abrahamic is shorthand for that. And then theistic origins means people who believe in they have their religious tradition, one of those three, but they believe there's somehow God involved in the origins of the planets, the sun, the stars, the galaxy, and humanity and animals and everything else. So how do they work these things out as scientists and theologians who are engaged in science? So wait, what was your question? I lost it as I got off on describing the.
Was there like a specific purpose, something you were trying to get out of that?
Yeah, and this was actually what happened to me was part of the problem of what happened in the room, and it was a good problem. Was people were saying such fascinating things, and then they would just say something, and you'd be like, "Wait, what did you just say? I've never heard that before in my life." And then you follow up on it, and they go down a bunny trail, and then we're like, "Okay, where were we?" Like back to the topic. So there's a lot of that going on. And the goal was really, I call it enduring collegial co-learning. Essentially, one of the goals of the project is to help these scholars become friends. I mean, like, not just people who work in the same area, but to actually personally know each other. So we had 5 days together, and a lot of that time was downtime. It wasn't actually technical time. It was time to just talk to one another and get to know about each other's families and life situations and go to museums together in Oxford. So that, 5 days isn't going to change your life on understanding any particular topic. But if you get to know somebody, then you'll have somebody to talk to for the rest of your life, right? So that was part of it, is to get people who are interested in having collegial friendships that they can then extend into the future and learn even more. So I hadn't really thought about the issues of occasionalism in the Islamic world and what that has to say about free will and AI. Had not really spent a dime of my time on that. Now I can't stop thinking about it because that gear has been turned on in my head with one of the presentations from one of our Muslim scholars. But I'm not stuck to my own devices of trying to work it all out on my own. I actually have those people I can go back to, and as I investigate, I can call them up or email them and say, "Hey, does this seem right to you, or am I on the right track, or what should I read to really understand this?" So that was a big part of it, which is strange for an academic workshop or get together. Most of the time, you're there to like present papers and then eventually publish those papers in journals or in a book. Which we will do some publishing because that will come out of it naturally. But the main thing is to get people to learn from each other and then be able to translate that learning outwardly to other spheres of life, to public conversations, to congregations, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian congregations, to college campuses, in all kinds of ways. So learning how to listen which was not hard for that group because everything was so fascinating and there was always something new in everybody's discussion. So learning how to learn again and learn from each other, and then now we're thinking about how do we translate these conversations for normal people.
So as you describe that, what I'm envisioning is some sort of a very clean-cut, like Venn diagram of those folks that are doing the Abrahamic stuff, and then those folks that are doing the not Abrahamic stuff, and then you trying to facilitate some form of overlap. But it's probably not that clean in practice, right?
Definitely not. And for this first one, we grab people who have already spent some time in this sphere in religion and science discussions. Some of them, like, that's what they do. They direct religion and science programs at Oxford or at Edinburgh. So lots of people were comfortable. It's interesting, lots of them were senior scholars, or several of them were senior scholars, who have been doing this kind of thing for a long time. But even they were just like, okay, this was different. It was interesting to have scientists and theologians, and by theologian I mean someone who works on their own scriptures, or they do philosophy of their own religion, or they do theology. And so it's funny when I tell people about this project, their first reaction is, especially right now, is they'll say, you're going to get Muslims and Jews in the same room together, and I was like, and Christians too. But in all reality, that was not only not a problem, that was a point of particular interest. Everybody wanted to hear from the other religion and how they deal with the same problems, that we all try to deal with. Like, oh yeah, how do Muslims deal with this issue of the sovereignty of God? How do Jews deal with this? And what are their sources for thinking through those issues? Is it all scripture, or are there things outside of scripture that help them think through these issues? That was not the problem at all. The hard part is getting scientists and theologians to hear each other. Like, it's almost like a marriage counseling. Now, again, these were some really good people that are used to these conversations, but even then you had to do a little bit. When you said, I felt, when you said X, I felt that you were talking about Y, but actually I think you're talking about something else. Can you help me understand that, right? And so that was a lot of it, is learning how to normalize the language between the fields. We think scholars are scholars are scholars, but they're not. They talk very different languages. They think in very different ways about their subjects. And so that's part of the goal, is to help them understand how the other people think about their subjects, and to learn how to bring some of that thinking into your subject where you're an expert.
So I'm curious then, for those scientists in the room that were not themselves committed to one of the Abrahamic religions, did they regard their own work as religious in some sense coming into the conference?
Yeah, so it's funny. It's an interesting. So everybody came from an Abrahamic religion in the group.
Okay.
But maybe some listeners might be familiar with this idea, but Christians who are nominally a Christian or a non-practicing Christian. In Christianity, we're so belief-centric, at least in Western Christianity, that we don't really, it's hard for us to imagine a Buju, as they call it, a Buddhist Jew, right? Which is very common, right? And so, like, it's not unusual to go to a Shabbat dinner in Israel, and Uncle Fred is a Buju. He's a Buddhist Jew. So he doesn't believe in the God of Israel. He doesn't believe God is real. He thinks something else is going on, but fully welcomed in Shabbat and the festivals, and nobody, they're just like, he's Jewish, but he's Buddhist. Some people might say, I wish he worshiped the God of Israel, but whatever. He's Jewish, right? And for Christians, we're just like, no, you can't, or you could be an atheist Jew, right? And that's part of it too. The one thing they don't like is Messianic Jews, Jesus following Jews. That becomes a little bit more problematic. But there are certain types of Messianic Jews that are not Jesus following. They actually follow a different Messiah, Rabbi Schneerson in New York. So that's not difficult for modern Judaism to kind of handle that. I'm an atheist Jew. And, I think we had a non-practicing Jewish scholar who was there, who understood Judaism, and he was studying Judaism and how Judaism had historically reacted to evolutionary science. And but I don't think he was a practicing Jew from everything that I could tell in talking to him. And so he just saw it as all very, but he was actually full in on every conversation. And, like you wouldn't have known he wasn't a practicing Jew because he was so interested in the whole conversation and how it worked out. So we do intend to invite atheists of other varieties and non-practicing people who don't come from a practicing religion. But the goal is really to get the three religions talking to each other. And I think it actually has there's a special ability. It unlocks a certain door in people's thinking when you just know the other people in the room not only come from a very different theological perspective, but there's actually probably something valuable in their perspective that I could learn from, and that might even be valuable for informing my perspective, or shaping it. I might be taking a tool for thinking about something in the way this tradition has thought about it for thousands of years. Say, oh, okay, actually that helps me think about this other thing in Christianity that I haven't been able to think about clearly. Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters.
Okay, so then I guess I'm curious, your involvement in this project, did that come then from your work on what hath Darwin to do with Scripture? Is that in some way connected? Just talk about the interaction there, I guess.
Yeah, no.
None. Okay.
Strangely enough. I mean, it is in a roundabout way connected. But yeah, I because I worked, it's actually probably more connected to my work on the Jewish Philosophical Theology Project in Jerusalem. That was a fully Jewish project. I was like the token Goy, the token Gentile on that team, and everybody else was Jewish. And again, it was from Orthodox Jews to kind of like somewhat practicing Jews, so it was me being the guy who brought Christians into those Jewish conversations over the years. For 6 years, I worked on that project with Yoram Chazoni, and I think that's what the people who are funding this project were they thought, like, okay, Dru knows how to work with multi-discipline and multi-religious scholars. And the interesting thing is, that's true. I felt very comfortable in that space. I didn't know a single Muslim scholar, or their actual scholarship. So I had to learn a lot of Muslim scholarship and scholars pretty quickly here. So that's been very interesting, and that's been fun because every day I'm learning something new. The Darwin book, though, was kind of a completely independent project. I guess because I had worked on the creation project, which this project is modeled after that one. That was that was at TEDS, may she rest in peace, but at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which was bringing together different flavors of mainly evangelical Christians, but all the way from progressive, like evolution happened and everything in the Bible can be explained in evolution, all the way to 6-day literal creationists who were scientists, like geologists and botanists and other things, and bringing them all together in a room and having them kind of hash it out, basically.
Okay.
And you can hear ours is less hashing it out. It's not insider baseball. It's not an insider debate. It's more learning from each other. Although the creation project, everybody was learning as well there. But this one is a little bit more collegial and learning focused.
Okay. Now, a lot of the scientists that you mentioned in the room, just when you were describing like whose backgrounds were there, seemed like it was largely biology, but I think you mentioned someone with a background in astrophysics, physics. And so when I think of like origins, there's like these cosmic origins, but there's also these like the origins of humanity. And in Genesis 1, you get both, maybe Genesis 1 and 2, if you feel like one zooms in on the other. So were you trying to do it all? Were you focused mainly on one? Like what was going on there?
This, again, because it was a pilot, or it was our first attempt, we tried to leave it wide open. So human uniqueness was the topic.
Okay.
What makes humans unique? So it did focus a little bit more genetically and biologically. And So we had a computational geneticist there. We had a regular old geneticist. I'm not sure what Zachary Ardern, but uh, honestly, I don't understand everything these people do, but it's fascinating stuff. We had a physicist who's now turned theologian. We have a computer scientist who does kind of computer science and theology now, Noreen Hertzfeld, who has been thinking about AI for a long time. We had a psychologist, Fraser Watts from Oxford, retired from Cambridge, who noted that he took a class on AI, and I'm not kidding, in 1967 at Oxford. He took
From
a class.
Alan Turing himself?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay.
I forget the name of the professor, but it was somebody who was in that circle. So these people have been thinking about this for a long time, and we really, this question of what makes humans unique from these different quarters, from the vantage of genetics versus psychology versus computer science and AI, and extraterrestrial intelligence also became a topic of interest. Boy, it's not that you got radically different answers, but you got radically different perspectives. And then to see how each religious tradition had to wrestle with each one of those perspectives. So if I can give one example that might help make it more
Please do.
concrete, is Josh Swamidas, who does computational biology, which I think just means he's also a medical doctor, but he essentially runs a lab where he creates AIs to solve biological problems. And that can be issues of how to study them. He's probably, if he listens to this, he's going to be like, no, that's not what I do. But he does something along those lines, if I can just put it that way. And he was giving a presentation on Neanderthals and why we should consider Neanderthals human, or why that makes sense for a lot of evidence that's come around in the last 50 years, but 10 years specifically with the genetic. They have the genomes, I think, of 10 Neanderthals worked out together. Which is why everybody on your 23andMe now, you can say, "Oh, I'm 2% Neanderthal." It's because of research that
the variants, I think, is what they call them. Yeah.
And he just mentioned one simple thing about humans that has a lot of implications, and especially biblical ones. Yeah, actually, ones that you would probably be interested in for any future doctoral work that you're going to do. And that is that humans are the only ones that have menopause. And that's just interesting, and that you're like, oh man. And he meant like a steep drop off in female fertility only, right? At a certain age. And he says, while that might not be inherently interesting, it actually creates the conditions for grandmothers, right, amongst hominids. And then that means that you can have a person whose sole energies are kind of dedicated towards the prospering of her children and her children's children and her children, and possibly even her children's children's children. It also creates the conditions for grandfathers as well. And you start piecing this together, that one little biological fact that humans uniquely have this thing called menopause, all of a sudden creates the conditions for clusters of humans that are thinking about their descendants beyond their own life range, right?
Yeah.
So this is something that you're, I think, going to be studying eventually in your doctoral work.
Absolutely.
So that and I look, and of course, in my book on Darwin, I wrote about this issue about how, like, there's this focus across Genesis 1 through 11 and beyond of not my children, not my grandchildren, but the great 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 grandchildren whom I will never see. How that thinking about them should impact my life today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't think I got a clear picture of how that gets worked out in Islam, because it was kind of a new thought that was thrown on the table, and I think everybody needs to think about it. But that's an example of, like, that's just one juicy tidbit that came out over 5 days of hundreds and hundreds that we're all going, oh, huh, what do you do with that? How does that work? Is that consistent across these religions, or is that different? Does it really have those implications, or So that's the kind of work we're doing.
That is absolutely fascinating, and perhaps I need to give him a ring and chat a little bit more about that. But
yeah, I don't think he's published anything on that yet, because he's a scientist, so he does publish in the kind of theology world. But I've been pushing him, saying, hey, that stuff on Neanderthals, I think a lot of people would really benefit, because I think most of us don't know anything about Neanderthals, and we have or we think they're cavemen, or we think they're these ugh, have no culture or brains or whatever. Their brains were actually bigger than ours, but for really weird reasons, we probably know that their brains did not physiologically function the same way as human brains. They actually, their neurons mapped together in a different way than ours did,
Okay.
which I'll tell you about off camera.
Yeah.
It's fascinating though. It involves growing many brains with their DNA, with Neanderthal DNA.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
crazy.
we'll connect on that later.
So when I say that it was like 5 days of having my mind blown, it was like this is just a tiny taste of some of the things. And the proteins, like that, they mapped out hundreds of thousands of proteins now, or sorry, billions of protein. Anyways, it's fascinating stuff.
Many.
Yes,
Many.
yeah.
Well, okay. So I'm curious then. You've got the Abrahamic faiths in a room together, and you're the Christian guy there on this team, and I think we're intending to interview your partners in crime, right?
Yeah. I direct the project, and I have two associate directors, Shoaib Malik, who is a science and religion professor at Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, or Edinburgh if you're reading it as an American. And then Rachel Pearson, who has worked on how evolution is taught in the public school systems in Europe and Israel and other places. And so she's my Jewish associate director. And we'll be talking to them in the coming weeks.
Okay, so maybe to prime that conversation then, as the Christian, working on that team, let's get into a little bit of the Christian view of theistic origins. And is there one view that when you're walking in that room as the representative, like you're saying, yeah, this is kind of the main view?
No.
No. Okay.
Definitely not. So you have, you could split them up into theistic evolutionist, or I think they like to be called creational evolutionist now, or something like that, or evolutionary creationist. That's the name that is preferred because it sounds less pejorative, I guess. So evolutionary creationist, because they're always like, well, we believe in creation too. We just believe it happened through this other mechanism. There's different flavors of that, and then there's basically people who think that there's a distinct historical point in history where you have an actual Adam and Eve as two historical people who are in substantial ways the father and mother of all humanity. And then again, that's why Neanderthals and others become a problem, because you're like, well, what do you mean by humanity? Do you include Neanderthals? And by most measurements, they probably would be included. And then you have people who like don't go either way. So like Josh Swamidas and Shoaib Malik, they both take the view that evolution happened, but God also had the garden, and He created the man and the woman as a special creation. And when they left the garden, they intermixed with the evolved humans. And then you can have an actual, like a very simple. It would take about 6,000 years or 4,000 years. 4 to 6,000 years, to basically explain how every human on the face of the earth in the days of Jesus was genealogically related to that one couple that came out of the garden.
Okay.
And apparently that's not a controversial claim according to population genetics.
And would they then tie that to Genesis 5, Genesis 5 and 6?
Yeah, so that's describing what happens when they leave the garden and intermix. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there you can hear the primacy, the issue that they're hanging on is that essentially what Paul says, from one man and all of the sin came into the world. The need to take that in a very historical fashion, and the need for there to be a historical man and woman in the garden. And then you have people all the way over, again, which includes scientists, they'll say like, look, there's no, I'm thinking of the people Reasons to Believe would be the organization who again have changed their views to adapt to the science, right? And so, and I can't claim to represent their views perfectly, but essentially they're going to say something like, there weren't humans up until a couple 100,000 years ago. Like, whatever you think humans are, they kind of pop on the scene about 100, 200,000 years ago. And kind of everything can be explained in that fashion if you just kind of push Eden back far enough in the timeline, you can kind of explain everything you want to explain about humans. And all these other things are just not humans. Homo naledi, Denisovans, Lucy, the famous Lucy. These are just variations on the apes. I think what's important here is nobody, and by nobody I mean even create what we'd call the creationist camp, like Ken Ham, etc. Nobody is disputing that natural selection happens, right? That the idea that you have a population of anything, humans, primates, birds, ants that live in a particular environment where resources are always going to be scarce at some point, and the ones that are best suited to that environment are the ones who can get the resources, and then they can propagate their genes. There's actually experimental evidence for that, so you can show in experiments exactly how that works. So nobody is really debating that kind of original natural selection view of Darwin. The question everybody is asking is, does that do enough to explain that with some other ideas like gene drift and gene flow? Does that explain how, like, you move upward from eukaryotes, prokaryotes, and even below, where you move from proteins and amino acids to basically some kind of cellular structures and eventually into mammals and beyond? And so you'll find people working this out in different ways. Some people are just happy to say, yeah, whatever the evolutionary science says, we'll go with that. And then at some point, Abraham comes on the scene. And that's where, that's one move that's made, is Abraham is where it's really important to say this is history begins there, right? And some will say, well, no, you can actually explain what's going on evolutionary back in these further. Some will just say, look, the biblical texts just don't do that. They don't care about this stuff. They don't do this kind of work. And so it's kind of a fool's errand to try and have this conversation in the logic of the biblical text. And I hope my book on Darwin showed why that's not true. That's just patently not true.
Well, and maybe that answers this next question, but I was curious then, if there is this diversity of Christian interpretations, is there one that you would uniquely describe as Hebraic?
No, I think my own mental jury is out on that one. So I think there are ones that I would say are definitely not Hebraic, or Hebraic in the way that we are thinking about it here, and that is the ones who basically just toss out text and say these texts are just poetry or they're just genealogies. They're not really trying to describe any of this. And what that does is just devaluing the biblical authors. You're basically saying, like, even if the biblical authors were alive today, and even if we could get them up to speed on evolutionary science, that they still wouldn't have anything to say about, evolution or creation, because they'd be like, yeah, we're not doing that kind of thing. Like when Alvin Plantinga supposedly heard my critique of him, he's just like, yeah, I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm an analytic philosopher. I don't do Bible stuff, right? So so I am tempted to think, because of what I see the biblical authors doing and the way they think and the way their methodology in thinking through the physical world, what they think the metaphysical structure of nature is, how nature works, that I think they actually would have some beliefs. Now, what exactly their beliefs are, I have a few that I could probably lay out, but I don't know if they would look at something like evolutionary creationism and go like, yeah, that could. I don't know if they would say like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was something like that. Maybe it's kind of a mystery to them, right? I mean, that's one way that I've read Genesis 1 through 11, is it kind of feels like whoever cobbled together the stories in Genesis, it was a mystery for them exactly how it went down. But these are the nodal points, right? These are the things that you can't mess up. Or maybe they would be like, no, 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 no. Let me show you what we were talking about. That could be something like that going on as well. I think it's okay to be a little open on this and not to settle. And I certainly don't think that Hebraic thought, the community, is meant to be one where we say, here's the Hebraic view of evolution. Here's the Hebraic view of, environmentalism. I certainly think you can say there are views that are more faithful to what the logic and the thinking of the biblical authors, and there are ones that are less faithful. I'm not so confident we're going to talk about the correct and the wrong ways of thinking Hebraic, of what Hebraic thought would come to. So Hebraic thought, it refers to the methodology of going with the grain of the biblical authors. It's not referring necessarily to the theological outputs.
Fair. And so if I could, because I think in one of our conversations you mentioned even a desire to create sort of a biblical philosophy of science.
Right.
And so I'm curious, if we pulled it back a layer then, I'm curious, would you say then that the biblical authors would be like pragmatists with respect to science? Would they be empiricists? Would they be, like
Right.
along that spectrum? Where would you see them falling?
Yeah, and there is some good work. Jan Dietrich writes about empiricism in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. I would say that, and I think I've said this before on here, the kind of foundations of scientific thinking. Sorry, my alarm just went off. The foundations of scientific thinking do seem to rhyme and jive very heavily with the way the biblical authors think about the world. And I say that in contradistinction to it doesn't seem to rhyme so much with the way the Greeks thought about the nature of the world and the structure of the world, or the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, or even the Chinese to some extent, depending on which part, or Indians. So there is a way in which scientific inquiry, it doesn't derive solely from the Hebrew Bible or the way the Hebrew biblical authors, but certainly there's some conceptual necessities that you need from the Hebrew Bible in order to do what we consider scientific inquiry today.
Sure.
So I'm not saying science is a Hebraic. I do think science is a perfectly good example of the expression of what the biblical authors think is a good way to explore the world on the whole, in community, through specialized knowing, by discerning attention to very specific aspects of reality. I mean, again, look in the ancient traditions. Where do you find anything like that? Like the Hebrew Bible is a unique source. And they are empiricists in the sense that they believe they're empiricalist, maybe I should say. They believe the real world can teach us about the real world. That creation is designed to teach us about creation. And we have to show due deference to that. And they are pragmatists. I mean, one of Jeremiah's arguments against the idols is he's like, idol worship doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So you have to define what work means there, what it means for something to work. But there is certainly a pragmatist bent. I think I learned that from our shared systematic theology professor, Mike Williams. I think at some point he pointed this out, like, yeah, something not working is a problem for the biblical authors. And so, and we could even say it like the description of marriage and child rearing and partnering for life and respecting your elders. Like, social psychology has shown that those actually work. Like, those are things that work in the real world, and they're not flittering idyllic realities.
Got it. Okay. Because I think, as I've heard you talk, I would assume that pragmatism was the better model than empiricism, but it certainly doesn't have to be an either or. And I'd just be curious to watch you kind of work it out, because I would, as I said, my bent is I think it's more pragmatic than empiricist, but.
Yeah, I think none of these are exclusive. But often, you and I have both studied philosophy, and the first time you hear a theory, you're like, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." And then you hear the counter arguments, and you're like, "Oh, yeah, that was stupid. Why did I ever believe that?"
Right.
And then you hear the counter arguments, and you're like, "Oh, wait a second." And so I think there's a way in which you think about empiricism and pragmatism and the likes, and they're on to something in the real world. Like,
Sure.
they're not making up things a whole cloth, right? They're trying to figure out something that they think is really real about the world. And so it shouldn't surprise us that if the biblical authors give us a kind of a full-orbed, robust view of what it means to be discerning and knowing about the order of creation and the way the world works and the way it exists, that it's going to have elements of all of those, what is good of each packed in there somewhere. So,
Gotcha. Well, cool. Well, I'm excited then to hear from your compadres on this project, how they handle some of these things, what their tradition that they've interacted with is is going to do. So
Yeah,
we'll look forward to
they're
that.
super cool and very interesting and intelligent people. So I'm very excited to introduce them to our audience.
Well, thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Mike.